Good morning. I want to begin by offering a word of thanks to our staff for their hard work, both in the planning and leadership of today's worship service. I want to offer gratitude for Irina and for Hillary for their beautiful music, which keeps getting better and better and better every week we hear it. Thank you both for the time and effort you put in to your trade. I also want to offer thanks to Tilly and to Jonathan and to Catherine for your words and your prayers this morning, as well as your hard work in making this worship service happen. Most of all, I want to offer thanks to you, the congregation of Sardis Baptist Church, for your participation in today's worship. It is your voice and your effort and your presence that makes this corporate worship. And it is good and pleasant and fitting for the church called Sardis to gather together in worship and offer praise and thanksgiving and joy for a good and wonderful God on a good and wonderful Sunday. And I think it's also fitting that we have a really good and a really wonderful and a really informative text to look at this morning. This morning's text comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. It's the story of the feeding of the multitudes. Hear now these good words. Verse 13 begins, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place all by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said to him, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is late. Send the crowds away, so they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said to them, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' The disciples replied, 'We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And Jesus said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate, and all were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were thousands and thousands and thousands, including women and children." Friends, these are good words from a good God for you, a good people. Thanks be to God. This morning's sermon is entitled, "Take It and Break It." Kingdom, order, realm, existence, gravitational force, reality. We've spent several weeks exploring the way or the nature or the truth of the world we occupy. There's the world Caesar seeks to portray, and there's the world God intends, the world that actually is. Parables help illumine the difference in kingdoms. The kingdom of heaven, God's reality, is like a tiny mustard seed or a little bit of yeast, items with little value in Caesar's world, and yet these agents meet basic needs in exponential ways. Shade for a garden and bread for a banquet. I think what I love the most about today's story, and there are many, 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 many things to love about today's story, is that we move away from parables and metaphors and we move toward the experiential. In other words, Jesus makes the hypothetical a reality. Now, don't get me wrong. I've loved exploring our text the last few weeks, which to my count have included more than 10 parables. The parables, if we invest in them, allow us to see what's hidden in plain sight. And if I'm honest with you, before spending so much time with these Matthean parables, I always had a tendency to miss the forest for the miracle, especially when it came to the feeding of the many, many thousands. I'll use the term many thousands instead of five because I think it's just as miraculous that women and children were fed too. But anyway, my mind always seemed to get sidetracked by the mechanics and the logistics of such an operation. I mean, really, think about it. The Bojangles on Randolph Road knows that the Panthers have 8 home games a year, and yet they've got at least a dozen staff and freezers full of fixins. And yet they are still overwhelmed by a few dozen cars in the drive-thru. Imagine what would happen if they had a crowd of thousands without any notice. Today's miracle is so massive, it diverts attention away from its strategist and toward its outcome. Perhaps that's the main point of the story. Jesus, our human authority or leader or teacher in illuminating God's kingdom, sure doesn't act like any authority we've ever known. Caesar, in any age, makes it clear whose realm it is. Caesar's. And Caesar, in any age, makes it clear who alone has the power to provide for and determine the people's welfare. Caesar. Caesar, in any age, after having done what he's obligated to do, will remind the people of how well the task has been fulfilled, and he'll make sure to do so in the most public of platforms. On Roman coins, Nero made sure that his face was on one side and a loaf of bread was on the other, lest you forget who fills your plate. 2,000 years later, we cash stimulus checks with the president's signature. We have our driver's licenses renewed while standing under a framed photo of our governor. And we don't ride an elevator without seeing a photo of our state labor commissioner. Shout out to Sherry Berry. And no matter your political persuasion, you might think the federal government needs to do more, or you might think it needs to do less. Regardless, each of us, in some way, believe that Caesar and his systems should be a source for aiding in our needs. So, I want to invite you for a moment to imagine what might happen if Nero, or the emperor, rather than Jesus, orchestrated this morning's feeding. Perhaps there would have been a parade float with Nero in a mink cape, shooting loaves of bread out of a t-shirt cannon as the hungry crowds toppled one another for a chance at sustenance. Perhaps a public address announcer would have reminded the crowd, "This bread brought to you by the emperor." Perhaps Nero would have told the crowd, "Remember, I alone can feed you, so don't cross me." And having successfully accomplished his mission, Nero would do a quick blitz of the Sunday talk shows and then dart back to the palace, surrounded by minions, and most likely the crowds would be hungry again tomorrow. Now think about what does happen in the story. Jesus finishes another day of healing and preaching and praying. Jesus gives all that he has, his time and his energy and his compassion, his physical, emotional, social, and mental attention. Jesus gives all that he has to the people he encounters. And what does Jesus do after offering such transformation? Jesus retreats to a quiet place to sit and to reflect and to pray. But the people desire more, so they follow Jesus. And even spent from a long day, Jesus has not yet spent up his compassion. So he gives the people more of what he has. I think it's worth noting that the cameras aren't rolling, nor is this a district that's going to reward Jesus with political capital for his efforts. And here's another thing to notice. Most of the time, if you want to draw a crowd, You better make sure that there's something to eat. Campaign rallies, fairs, barbecues, church gatherings, movie theaters, etc. Usually, it's the food that gets and keeps people at the event. Nero lures the people to parades with loaves of bread and pomp and circumstance. Jesus, on the other hand, preaches in the wilderness, the desert, we're told, late into the evening, and the people just keep on coming. Jesus is so captivating and his words are so filling that the crowd isn't thinking about food, but the disciples are. And they tell Jesus that the crowd should be dismissed in order that they might be able to go back into the towns and villages and procure supplies. The Exodus image should not be lost on us. In the wilderness, the Israelites grumbled to Moses when the supplies got light. They were preconditioned to believe that only Pharaoh's infrastructure could quell their hunger pangs. Sure, the system was abusive, but it beat the alternative of starving. God responded to their criticism by providing manna. Here again, even in the presence of Jesus, the disciples are preconditioned to believe that only Caesar's systems can solve the issues of hunger. They are listening to the very wisdom of God, and yet they are worried about resources. So, this week, it's not a mustard seed and it's not a pinch of yeast. Instead, it's a couple of packs of Lance crackers and a few cans of sardines. Jesus blesses the food, offers gratitude to God, and invokes God's presence and power in bringing about transformation. God, here are the resources we've got, Jesus says. Would you help us multiply them? There is a balance of humility and faith and confidence. This story is not about what Jesus is going to do. This is about what God's going to do and what God has already done. And then Jesus uses the disciples to distribute the bread. In other words, Jesus empowers the disciples to do what he has done. And I imagine the disciples empower the ones they encounter to do what Jesus has taught them to do. And the text tells us that everyone ate, and that everyone was full, and that there were plenty of leftovers. And I ask you, how many leftover loaves do you reckon Nero had at his parades? And how many leftover stimulus checks do you reckon we'll have this fall? And I ask you, how many people will go unfed even when Caesar has the best of intentions? Is it really all that audacious to believe that a crowd of 10 to 15,000 people can feed themselves, can acquire what they need by sharing rather than hoarding resources? God created a world where a tiny mustard seed can become a shrub as tall as a large tree. And God created a world where a pinch of yeast can become 100 loaves of bread. And God created a world where ordinary things can be transformed into extraordinary sustenance. Surely, each of us has an ounce of humility, and another of generosity, and still another of kindness, and of love, and of courage, and of faith. Is there not a spiritual photosynthesis or a theological fermentation that it can occur in each of us, which would enable our minimal resources to have maximum effects? I mean, I don't want to oversimplify things this morning, but every time we have a church potluck, I am amazed that a few dozen dishes have the capacity to feed hundreds. Collected spare change and canned goods and crayon boxes pulled together somehow provide an excess for our neighbors. God has always and will always provide us with enough. We don't need to read today's text to know that truth. But what today's text reminds us of is that it's not Caesar who originates, nor is it Caesar who facilitates the resources to meet our needs. It's God and God alone. That means the world must strive, that means the world we must strive for, the world we can live into, is steeped in cooperation. The acknowledgement that ours is a world where God's people and God's lands operate in accordance with God's nature and God's character. God empowers us to feed one another. God invites us to be full rather than stuffed. God transforms the ordinary and the meager into the extraordinary and the abundant. Jesus spent a lifetime asking God to use the people and resources at his disposal to help meet the world's needs. Jesus taught the disciples to do the same. Sardis Baptist Church, may God grant us ears to listen and eyes to see and hearts to open in order that we too might break bread, not for the taking, but for the sharing. Friends, may it be so, and may it be soon. Amen.